Okay, so this series is based on this book by Lama Yeshe, which is called Life, Death, and After Death. And the talks in here were given in 1983 in Zurich to kind of a general audience. So Lama Yeshe doesn't go into great detail about some things that I think maybe would be worth going into detail about. He talks in very general terms to a very general audience. And I think that the folks that are here tonight with me, and probably people who tune into the recording, are interested in much more detailed information. So I will endeavor to provide some of that. And the way I'll do that is by making reference to a couple of books which are actually in the suggested readings that are at the end of the book, which the editor has indicated would be useful, and they are. So one of them is called Death, Intermediate State, and Rebirth in Tibetan Buddhism. I'm sure it's still available. It's a skinny little book. This is a very interesting book because, well, for a couple of reasons. For one thing, translator is Jeffrey Hopkins, who's quite expert, even though this was done quite a long time ago. And the commentary on a very traditional text is given by Lati Rinpoche. And Lati Rinpoche passed away quite some time ago. So it's not likely that too many people who are listening to this talk would have had the opportunity to meet with him or to take teachings with him. He was a very great master and could speak on the subject with real expertise. So I'm going to be referring to this a number of times. And then finally, the real treasure is this one by the Dalai Lama, which is called Mind of Clear Light, Advice on Living Well and Dying Consciously. And if you've attended some of my other talks, you know I talk about clear light ad nauseum because it's kind of the essential concept, but also the goal of practice in Tibetan Tantra, highest yoga Tantra. And I'm going to be using this book a lot. I'm going to be commenting on this book a lot because His Holiness in this book basically does a very clear commentary. Oh, and it's also, by the way, translated by Jeffrey Hopkins again, so the language is consistent. That's helpful. His Holiness goes into great detail, but with great clarity about the points which are laid out in the traditional text very concisely. So things that you might have questions about in this text usually get answered in this text. So this kind of approach may not be typical for talks that took to Norbuling, but you know, we all do things in a different way, and I'm a professor, so this is the way I do things. You know, books which are references to other books which are explained by other books. That's just the way the academic world works, okay? So before I even get into any of this, I thought a lot about, well, everybody thinks a lot about dying. I mean, I don't know how much we think about it when we're really young. I think we probably do. And the older we get, the more we think about it. And, you know, one can get obsessive about the issue, or one can be completely unconscious of the issue. But, you know, the reality is, whether we're obsessive, clear-minded, or completely unconscious, death is a reality for everybody. That's just the way it is. You know, we used to say death and taxes the only certainties in life. I'm not so sure about taxes. It seems like if you're really rich enough, taxes aren't even a certainty in life. But death certainly is, no matter how wealthy you are. As they say, you can be Elon Musk, and if your time comes, all that money isn't going to change the time of your dying. It isn't. If it's your time to die, you will. Okay. So, I mean, it's a topic that one should think about, but not morosely. In the Tibetan tradition, and actually in most Buddhist traditions, the idea is that if you think about death on a regular basis, it actually enhances your life because it makes each moment in its own way much more precious. And this is not simply in the Buddhist tradition. I remember a story that was told by the then dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And Kay and I used to spend a lot of time there, which was, a little odd since we were Buddhists. It was kind of interesting for me to figure out whether or not I was going to take communion. Being a Jewish Buddhist, that was sort of a little bit strange. But anyway, the dean of the cathedral, whose name was Alan Jones, traveled a lot. And he told a story about being at a monastery in the Sinai, which really stuck with me and which I'll share with you because it illustrates this point of the value of thinking about our transitoriness on a regular basis. So he went to this monastery in the Sinai, a very old Coptic monastery in the Sinai. Christian, if you don't know, Copts are Christians. And he goes into the monastery and he walks across the courtyard, and there's several really large holes in the courtyard. And he asks, what are those all about? And the monk that's with him, that's showing him around the monastery, says, well, when we first entered the monastery, we dig our own grave. And it sits there waiting for us. And we contemplate that every day. So I think a lot of people in the audience at Grace Cathedral must have thought that that was really kind of bizarre. But I thought it was profound because it puts everything in a context that is really important. And the Buddhist tradition is quite aligned with that. It's very important to think about our own passing, our own death, but not in a morose way because of the way in which it makes life fuller. Now, I find that to be true. But there are other reasons for understanding the process of dying, which perhaps are different for Buddhists than for Christians, or possibly even for Jews, I don't know, or Muslims, or whatever the case may be. Because there is a process that's involved in dying. And as His Holiness says in this book, that the nature of your mind when you're dying is going to determine the character of your next life. Now, I want to set aside the question of future lives, past lives and future lives for just a moment and come back to it. But the point he was making is that we all are driven by masses of karma. If you like to believe in former and future lives, then that karma is something that's been accumulated over thousands of years, or in fact eons, right? If you don't like to think about it from that point of view, and you're unsettled or unsure or simply don't believe in the notion of former and future lives, then you still have habit patterns that have been accumulated in this lifetime. And those habit patterns are going to be functioning at the time of your death. So the way in which you pass is going to be determined by those habit patterns. If you've accumulated certain positive habit patterns, certain abilities of concentration, for example, then the dying process could look one way. If you haven't done that, it could look another way. If you're filled with fears about dying, the dying process is going to look pretty unpleasant. I remember the way in which my father died, and it wasn't wonderful. He was very much an atheist, and he didn't die very happily. He kind of got a nasty turn of mind as he was dying. And none of that is necessary, you know. Lama Yeshe makes the statement in this book that dying can actually be a wonderful experience. It can be a blissful experience. That's a little hard to conceive of, but he asserts that that's the case. And it would be dependent upon your mental abilities and your state of mind and your motivation and your attitude. Anyhow, the point that His Holiness makes, which is relevant for people who believe in former and future lives, or rebirth, or reincarnation, whatever you want to say. The point His Holiness makes is that all these different patterns of karma, all these different habit patterns, to use our language, all these different kinds of motivations and impulses are with us at the time that we're dying. But some will predominate, and we can choose what will predominate. So even if we have a mass of negative karma, you know, like maybe our negative karma at the time we're dying is outweighing our positive karma 3-to-1. If we could generate a virtuous mind, and then we'll have to talk about what a virtuous mind is. He says, if we can generate a virtuous mind, that's the characteristic of our mind which will determine our next life. It will determine our choice of parents. It will determine the situation in which we're born. It will also determine what goes on in the space between one life and another, the so-called bardo. Bardo simply means between in Tibetan. I mean, it's not a very esoteric word. Lama Yeshe doesn't talk about the space between lives. He talks about the dying process. He doesn't talk in detail about the process of being reborn. And since he doesn't do that, I'm not going to talk about that particularly either, which lets me off the hook because that's not something I've studied very much about. But if you do want to know more about it, then I have a recommendation for you. Excuse me. Some of you know the name Bob Thurman, Robert Thurman. He was a great translator, a great Buddhologist. Since being retired from Columbia University, he sort of cut loose from his needs to be a respectable academic. And he's gone back to his, perhaps I should say, his hippie roots. I'm not sure if that's really completely appropriate, but he's cut loose and he's speaking very directly as a Buddhist to other Buddhists. And he's not making any attempts to be a professor of religious studies and therefore somehow stand outside of Buddhism and look at it objectively. He's speaking as a Buddhist. He's been working a lot with a man by the name of Andrew Holek, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I may not be. This gentleman has explored lucid dreaming very extensively. He's published a number of books on how you can lucid dream if it's something that you want to do. Excuse me, my throat is really mucousy today. It might be because of the smoke from the fires, or might be from some other reason. It's just a tendency of mine. But, so you'll excuse me if I clear my throat a lot. The reason this is relevant is what lucid dreaming is the ability to be self-conscious and aware when you're in the dreaming process and know you're dreaming, and therefore change the narrative of the dream through your will. Now, that might just seem like, okay, well, what's the big deal? But as he has pointed out in working with Bob, the ability to control your dreams in this way is very similar to the ability to control what goes on for you in the bardo. When you have that mental capacity to control your dreams, at least according to the two of them, you would have the mental capacity to control what goes on in the bardo, which is then very important. So if that's something that interests you, and learning more about the in-between state is something that interests you, these talks that Bob has recorded, he does a number of podcasts on these things, Bob Thurman Podcast, or Menla is the organization he's working with now. It's his retreat center. You can track all this stuff down, and it could be of great value to you if it's where your interest is. As I said, I'm not going to go there. For one thing, I can't lucid dream. I consider myself blessed if I fall asleep at night and wake up in the morning without waking up too many times and get 7 hours of sleep. So trying to interfere with my dreams by doing anything besides rolling over and going unconscious is not something that interests me very much, but that just speaks to my own limitations. It seems for many people, when you get old, managing to sleep decently is a challenge. And it certainly has been for me. I know it is for Bob. We've had these conversations. He's waving at me like, yeah, I'm there. I know about that. Oh, no, he's leaving. Okay. Must be he's waving for a different reason. So let me get on with it. So anyway, so if you want to know more about the in-between state, then I refer you to that source. Okay. But that does raise a couple interesting questions, I think. One interesting question is, how is it that there can be a Tibetan tradition about all of these things? Like, why would these monks know about what happens in between death and rebirth? That's, I think, a pretty interesting question. I'm not going to touch that question. But here's another question that I am going to touch at some point. How would these monks, how would this tradition know in detail about the dying process? And there's a very good answer for that, okay? What that answer is that the psychology or the psychophysiology of dying is very similar to the process that really extraordinary yogis go through in their meditation process. So when I say extraordinary yogis, I mean people like Tsongkhapa, great masters, who in the process of doing certain kinds of meditation actually emulate the dying process. So we'll talk more on the course of these talks about why they would even do that. I mean, I've talked about it in some of my other talks, okay? But I'm going to be much more specific about it in this context over the next few weeks. The physiology of dying, or the process of dying, is similar to the process of deeply withdrawing yourself inward toward the essence of yourself, which could be called Buddha nature or Buddha mind. But in the Tibetan highest yoga tantra tradition, it's called clear light mind. Hence the name of His Holiness book, Mind of Clear Light, because this would be the goal of meditation process. Now, can any of us get there? Maybe yes, maybe no. In a sense, it doesn't matter, because we get to where we get to. We get to where we get to, wherever that is. And where that is gives us certain tools to deal with what will inevitably happen to us, which is that we will die, and that we can die in different kinds of ways, hopefully consciously, with some degree of consciousness, and with some degree of positive intentionality. Now, this then sort of segues back to the whole question of former and future lives. And this is, I think, a big issue for Westerners. If you're born in India, or if you're a Tibetan, you're born into a culture in which is taken for granted that you have lived in some kind of a body before, and that you will live in some kind of a body in the future. That's just the way it's going to be. And you don't really have to think about it. It's a given, unless you choose to reject it. But for most people, it's just there in the culture, okay? For Westerners, it's different. You know, we're born into a world where perhaps we're complete materialists. That would have been natural for me in the family in which I was born, because both my parents were atheists, right? So we might be scientific materialists, or we might be born into a Christian environment in which we think there's one life and then we go to heaven or we go to hell, or if you're a Catholic, you might go to limbo before you get to one or the other. But that sort of is the way you see reality. So how is it possible then to shift into a Buddhist frame of mind? Now, I lived at Green Gulch Zen Center. That's one of the practice places for San Francisco Zen Center for a couple of years. And almost everybody there was born in this country of Caucasian parents. They were converts. And they mostly said, well, look, we think about Buddhist teaching about former and future lives as being a metaphor. You know, past lives means what's past in our life. Future lives means what's future in our life, and that's good enough. From the Tibetan point of view, that's not good enough. From the Tibetan point of view, if you hold that view, you're not even a Buddhist, right? Well, maybe it doesn't matter whether you're a Buddhist or not. You know, maybe the teachings that are incorporated in Buddhism are of interest, and whether you consider yourself a Buddhist or not is irrelevant. Okay. Now, if you're a materialist, if you're a scientific materialist, then the general notion you have is that when you die, everything stops. It's all over. Nothing persists. That's actually a decision. That belief is actually a decision that one adopts. Because in truth, if you think that there is no life of any sort after death, because there's no evidence for life after death, the reality is, if you're honest from an evidentiary point of view, there's also no evidence for the fact that there isn't something after death. There's no evidence from a scientific point of view, one way or the other. You can't take a position one way or the other because there's no evidence, because that particular issue can't be addressed by science. Okay. So where does that leave us? Scripturally, there's all kinds of statements about former and future lives. In the Tibetan tradition, there are logical arguments for why there would have to be former and future lives. And I'll share some of those logical arguments with you over the course of this month, of these 4 talks. But I'm not sure that on this issue, even logical arguments are adequate, because we're not entirely logical beings. We're emotional as much as we're logical. And I think that what's convincing, one way or the other, is experience. Now, I don't mean, okay, now wait, you have to die, and then we're going to know whether or not there is a future life. Well, that's not going to be a very satisfactory way to answer the question, because that doesn't help us address the things we might want to do in this life. Because, oops, too late, we're already dead. Now we're dealing with a situation. What are we going to do about it? Okay. Experience is what changes everything. But I don't mean the experience of dying. I mean the experience of practicing what's embedded in highest yoga tantra, which simulates the dying process, or is similar to the dying process. So I say this a little bit from my own experience, because for a long time, I was what I would have considered a Buddhist, but which my own main teacher, my own main Lama, would have said, you're not really a Buddhist, David, because you don't really believe in future lives. You don't really believe in former lives, so you're not really a Buddhist. So this is my teacher of highest yoga tantra would have said this to me. But I persisted in my own practice. And over the years, for myself, a few experiences have emerged which have made it clear to me, and I'm not talking about some kind of great profound experience, I'm not some great yogi, but that's all the more reason to say it's helpful that some experiences have emerged which have been convincing. It took a long time. I mean, I'm 75 now, and I started practicing highest yoga tantra when I was in my early 40s. But at least I got there, you know, from the point of view of what my teachers would have suggested was an important set of experiences. So the orientation that I'm going to take in these classes is this context of what is it that the Lamas tell us about the dying process? What is it that we can learn in our own experience by practicing basically in highest yoga tantra, so that we can generate experiences which validate certain teachings. And because they validate certain teachings and clarify something that could only otherwise be accepted logically, okay, because the experiences do that, they reorient one. They reorient one towards how to live one's life. They reorient one toward, presumably, how to go through the dying process. And then, presumably, into the next life. Now, I have to say presumably about some of these things because I'm not there yet. I'm not in a big hurry to die. I'm not trying to give some sort of suggestion that I'm in a big hurry to die. But I have a different attitude toward it. So because I'm just an ordinary person, anybody could have a different attitude toward it. And that's sort of the main point that I want to make along these lines. Okay, so that's overview. That's that sort of context. And before I sort of start jumping into the material, let me take a break at this point and see if there are questions. Because what I've tried to do is give a certain type of an overview and a rationale and intentionality to what I'm going to do. But that may have generated some questions. So let me check in with you. Any questions? Just speak up if there are. If they're not, then I'll just go forward. Okay, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the overhead light. So hold on just a minute. Let me pause the. Okay. So let me start out with a comment from Lama Yeshe's book. He opens the book, which is actually the second chapter in this book, but he opens the book with a chapter called Why We Should Understand the Death Process, which is sort of what I've been talking about. And he writes this: Buddhism also explains that the fundamental nature of human consciousness is pure and clear, that the nuclear essence of human beings is their mind, not this body of flesh and blood. Furthermore, we believe that recognizing our lives as pleasurable or miserable depends largely on how our mind interprets them. If you think your life is miserable, it becomes miserable. And so the corollary, of course, is if you think your life is wonderful, it becomes wonderful. It doesn't really matter from a so-called objective point of view what's going on. What matters is what your mind takes to be reality. And that's what reality becomes. So the mind is the critical factor. So I'm going to jump to the next chapter here, which he titles The Nature of Mind. Now he's given us some sort of insight into what he considers to be the nature of mind, which is that it's pure and clear. And bear with me, because in time it will become apparent why I'm talking about mind now. And obviously its relevance to the death process, the dying process. First thing he says is that each human being has a mind. That's not new news to anybody. And that mind has three divisions: gross, subtle, and most subtle. Similar, we have a body, and it has three divisions, which are gross, subtle, and most subtle. Now, if you've been following my talks, you know that I've focused on this issue quite extensively. That we have a coarse mind, which is the sensory mind. It's the mind or the consciousness that's associated with our sense organs: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, by the way, also. It's a coarse sense organ. 6. That's right, Donnie, 6. We have a subtler mind, which is a different way of cognizing. I won't get into that right now. And then we have the subtlest mind, which is the clear light mind. So that's what he's talking about with this division in 3. But the important point is not so much that there's a division of 3 minds, but that our mind or our consciousness could be understood as being kind of like layered from coarse to very subtle. And the thing about this layering is that the subtler aspects of the mind can be conscious of the coarser aspects of the mind, but not the reverse. Okay. The reason for this is, as Lama Yeshe says, when the gross mind is no longer flashing or functioning, the subtle mind then has a chance to arise. And that's one of the functions of Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. It eliminates the gross concepts, giving the subtle mind space to function. But here I'm talking about sort of the reverse of this. But the main point is that when coarser sense minds, sense-oriented minds are functioning, then subtler minds are covered, they're hidden. Lama Yeshe describes them as being covered by blankets, as it were. That's the metaphor that he uses throughout the book. Hold on. So the basic process of meditation, in the simplest sense of getting to the subtlest part of oneself, is to do something that suppresses or halts the functioning of the coarser aspects of mind. And that allows what's naturally already there to become apparent. And in doing this in subtler, or maybe I should say deeper and deeper ways, removing the coarse, removing the somewhat less coarse, removing the subtle, removing the somewhat less subtle, and finally revealing the most subtle mind, what one experiences is one's true essential core, one's nature, which they say is not just a clear light mind, it's one's nature as a Buddha. That mind understands everything. That mind is peaceful. That mind is beatific. The word that's often used is blissful, but I find that bliss is a term that is a little problematic in English. But beatific, I think, beatific is a useful word, okay? Beatific. So the whole process of dying, as the process of practicing meditation, as it turns out, is a process in which coarser levels of oneself either naturally fall away in the dying process or are intentionally suppressed or turned off or blocked in the meditation process. And the experiences are similar in terms of mental capacity that's released in the process, in terms of even physical external signs of what's going on. And that's the reason that the Lamas can teach us about the dying process, because they've gone through the meditation process to get to that clear light mind. And they've come back out of that experience to tell us about it. They've gone into it and come out of it, gone into it and come out of it. And they're as familiar, someone like Tsongkhapa is as familiar with achieving these deepest levels of mind as we are familiar with going to the refrigerator, for crying out loud. I mean, if you read the life of Tsongkhapa, he's an amazing yogi, an absolutely amazing yogi with capacities that are almost incomprehensible to us. And so he's left behind a record, as have many other great yogis, of this process. Now, if we're critically minded, do we want to believe them? Why should we believe them? Why should we believe what Tsongkhapa says about the deepest aspects of meditation or the process of dying? So the Buddhist answer to that question is, try it. See how much in your own experience you can replicate the basic, more superficial, let's say, experiences of someone like Tsongkhapa or these other great yogis. And if you can, and if what you find is that what they say about experiences that you don't normally have, but which you can have through practice of meditation, without becoming a great yogi, just with the practice of meditation, if you find that the experiences that you have are similar to the experiences that they talk about having, then it might be reasonable to assume that they're speaking accurately about the experiences that you haven't had yet, and that they're reliable. Anyway, this is the Buddhist view. So it's worth making the effort to try and practice, to see then if what they have to say is true, besides the obvious benefits of practicing. Now, you could raise the question, well, I mean, how can I have these kinds of experiences? I mean, how can I experience subtle nature of mind where the thinking process is radically different in some way? So the answer to that, the Tibetan answer to that anyway, is that you're already having these experiences, that you have them every 24 hours. You just tend not to be very cognizant of them. Because the sense consciousness mind, which is the mind that we have when we're awake, that's a mind that we think we're fairly familiar with. Although I think actually if you were to investigate it closely, you would discover that you're not really that familiar with it. That you might think you know what your mind is, but you might discover that actually there's not very much you know about your mind. Or maybe it would be better to say that there's a whole lot about your mind that you don't know, and that you didn't know you didn't know. Even though that sounds a little strange, but that's always the tricky stuff, you know. It's not the stuff we don't know. It's the stuff we don't even know we don't know. Okay. But as it turns out, the process of dying is something that we experience during the 24 hours of life, because falling asleep and dreaming is entering into the space of the subtle mind. Dreaming is like the subtle mind. And we're in deep dreamless sleep. It's like we're experiencing the equivalent of the clear light mind, the subtlest mind of all. Now, the problem, of course, is that when we're in deep dreamless sleep, experiencing this subtlest mind, which is similar to the clear light mind, we're unconscious. We don't know what's happening. Unlike the yogis who enter it consciously. So how can they enter it consciously? In the same way as they manage to enter the dream mind consciously and transform their dreams, which we can learn to do. I mean, if you buy Andrew Holnick's book, or take one of his courses, or attend one of his seminars or workshops, he'll teach you how to lucid dream. He'll teach you how to get into that state of mind. But there are other ways to get into that state of mind. If you're sitting and doing a meditation practice called shamatha, okay, which is called calm abiding in English, calm abiding mind, which is where you hold your attention one-pointedly on something for long periods of time. And as your attention or your mind wanders, you bring your attention back to that something that you're staying focused on. Could be your breath, could be an image, could be the nature of your own mind, if you could find your own mind, which turns out to be fairly difficult, right? If you can develop shamatha, then one of the things that happens is the sense consciousness experiences begin to fall away. Because if you're focusing on a mental image, for example, and if you're keeping your focus on a mental image, then what you're not doing is you're not paying attention to the dog that's barking behind me, which I wish I could pay less attention to. Right? You're not paying so much attention to your own breathing. You're paying attention to the mental image. You're not paying attention to what your body feels like. Are your knees sore? What's your back feeling like on the meditation cushion? You're paying attention to the mental image. It's not like you're actually suppressing these other things. It's what are you paying attention to? And if you do that successfully, then what happens? Well, that means the coarse consciousness of sensory experience is dropped away. And what are you left with? You're left with the subtle consciousness of pure thought or mere thought, right? So you can experience that. And that's no different than the consciousness of dream. And in fact, if you get into that state, you'll find that your mind becomes very dreamlike. So I haven't mastered shamatha. I'm not trying to suggest that I have, but there have been times when I've been meditating over the years, where more of this kind of sense experience begins to fall away and my attention stays very focused. Usually that happens because there's something beatific going on. So I'll come back to what that might be when I talk more about highest yoga tantra. And blissful beatific experiences are very compelling. You don't want to pay attention to your sore knees or your aching back or the random thoughts that show up. It's like you just naturally go back to that state of mind. And it is very dreamlike. And when you begin to experience these kinds of things, then what that does is it validates at a certain level the teachings, right? And things emerge because it's a state of mind which has a level of clarity that the ordinary sense consciousness states of mind don't have. One of the things that emerges is you get a clearer sense of the actual nature of your own mind. So I'm perhaps being a little bit obscure here. In highest yoga tantra, you meditate on images of the Buddha. I'll be more specific. In fact, you meditate on an image of the Buddha and you develop the deepest sense possible that you are that Buddha. It's called assuming divine pride in the clumsy English translation. But you meditate on yourself as being what you really are, your Buddha nature. And when you do that successfully, when your mind can focus on that successfully, blissful or beatific experiences begin to arise. And so that the mind gets very stable and very focused on those experiences. Yes, Zani, the answer to your question that you posted as a text is a yes. Zazen equals Mahamudra. Successful Zazen equals Mahamudra. Unsuccessful Zazen does not equal Mahamudra. Okay. I'm not going to go there. I was thinking of a statement by Dogen, but that would take us too far away. It'd be too easy to get distracted, and once I get distracted,
what do you mean? Dogen says.
I'll lose the train of my thought. So I'm not going to go there. Okay.
Dogen says.
So I'm already losing it. Okay. So my main point, since I've lost some of the thread, my main point is that just as the great Lamas left us a roadmap that describes the deepest meditation process. It also describes the process of dying. So we can follow that roadmap and ascertain for ourselves some of the truths of what they've left behind and extrapolate from that to other things that they've taught us or that they have left in the scriptures for us to read. Okay. All right. So that's the main point that I want to make this evening. And that's sort of the place that I want to stop. Where I'll pick up next week, and because I'd like you to think about this. I'd like you to think about this process. And I'd like you to think about the fact that all the aspects of one's self, in the sense of birth and death, are already with us in the 24-hour cycle, although unconsciously. Where I'll pick up with the next week is to talk about the specific stages of dying. And in the text, they lay out, so I'll just sort of give you a preview of this. In the texts, they lay out that there are sort of 8 stages or 8 levels of the process. And it's a little bit confusing because what's emphasized, or what will be a little bit confusing, is what's emphasized in the teachings is the transition from one state to another. Not so much that the teachings describe how sort of the solid aspect of oneself begins to deteriorate in the dying process, or the energetic aspect of oneself deteriorates in the dying process. They don't really talk about the energy aspect or the solidity aspect, but they talk about the transition aspect. So it can be a little bit confusing. And so what I'm going to try and do is lay out these 8 stages and talk about the transitions between the first and the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth, and try and clarify that, because just a second. Because in my own experience of trying to understand the dying process and the way it's laid out in the scriptures, or the commentaries rather, it's always been very hard for me to grasp the transitional dynamic way in which the Tibetans describe things, because my mind keeps wanting to be very rigid and say, okay, first I'm in box 1, now I'm in box 2, now I'm in box 3, now I'm in box 4. And they don't describe things that way. They describe things as, this is what it's like to go through the doorway between box 1 and box 2, or room 1 and room 2, between room 2 and 3 and room 3. So that's what I'll endeavor to clarify in our next meeting. And then in the meeting after that, if all goes well, I'll put that in the context of some meditation practices that are sort of what you can do in this life now equivalent to the dying process. And in that sense, I'll be talking about what are called the winds, the channels, and the drops, which are the internal physiology which transforms, which actually is functioning in our life process and changing all the time in our life process, but goes through a certain transition in the dying process, but also in the meditation process. So there's a lot of conversation about channels, especially 3 channels in the spine, the central channel and the 2 channels on the side, solar and lunar channels, the place where they tie up or meet, which are called chakras, which in Sanskrit means wheel, which are described in different systems somewhat differently, but in the Tibetan system, the channels run from the forehead over the top of the head and back down the spine. And so then the chakras on the top of the head, in the center of the head, in the throat, in the heart, more or less below the navel, but again against the spine, in the sexual area, and the base of the spine. And these become activated in certain ways in the meditation process and also in the dying process. So I'll be talking about those things. So then there are winds that move in those channels, which are important to understand. And then in the dying process, there are drops which move through those channels, which actually exist in certain locations and transform and move through the channels. So that's sort of a preview of what's upcoming. And I'll try and be as clear as possible on each of these different issues and how they all fit together. Because once you get the common language of what's being described here, then you can paint a larger picture of what goes on in the successful meditation process and also what goes on in the dying process. But in fact, what happens during the 24-hour cycle of every day, what happens in the 24-hour cycle of every day of wake, dream, and deep sleep, because these processes are at work all the time. And I'll speak a little bit about some of the dangers here, because, excuse me. I think especially for Americans, there's a strong impulse to push real strongly, intensely, to try and get things done rapidly, rather than to allow things to develop naturally in the meditation process. And that there are certain dangers that are associated with this. One of which is messing up your sleep, which you definitely don't want to do. The other thing is creating problems that are called wind disorders, which make you a little bit crazy and which are possible outcomes of not being very gentle and relaxed with oneself and being in a hurry. As I said, as Americans, we're in a hurry. I want to wake up. I want to be enlightened right now, so I'm going to push. And the natural process of the body and mind is not push. The natural process is gradual, sort of like the sprouting of the vegetables in my garden, right? First, we put the seeds in the soil, and then we water, and we wait, and nothing happens. And we water some more, and we wait, and nothing happens. And then one day we go outside, and we look at where we're about to water, and lo and behold, there's this tiny little green thing. And so I keep watering, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then if I'm in a big hurry to have something I can eat, I'm going to be frustrated because the bok choy takes as long as the bok choy takes to grow. And if I try and harvest it before it's ready, it doesn't taste good. But if I wait and let it grow in its natural way, then it's luscious and it's nutritious. And so the meditation process is like that also. It takes time. One doesn't push. Okay. So that's it for this evening. We do have some time. If there are questions, I'd be glad to take any questions. Just unmute yourself and ask away, and I will endeavor to answer. And if they're not, then that will be it for the evening. So where are we at?
I'd like to ask how you spell Andre Hollick's name.
Hold on a minute.
Okay, I don't
I'm
know.
gonna get it. I have a copy of one of his books, so I'm gonna get it. Let me put us on pause for a minute. Okay, the bad news is I don't have the book here. So what I'll do, Bob, I will look it up. I will look up the name for you, and I'll send you a text or an email. Oh, no, that's the misspelling, Donnie. That's not how his name is spelled. I know that much.
But if you put that in there, you'll get to him.
And the other
So,
question is that you mentioned something about Bob Thurman Podcast. Is that a regular series? I can look
yeah,
that up.
if you do a Google search on Bob's name, you'll find the Bob Thurman
Okay,
podcast.
great.
He does a lot of stuff that's free and that's you can just tune into. For some bizarre reason, I'm thinking that this podcast about dying that had a big influence on me was Thurman Podcast number 53, but I wouldn't count on that being the
I'll
case.
try that.
You might try it, but I wouldn't.
Yeah.
My memory is that's all very dubious. But yeah, there's a lot of free stuff out there that he's posted. He also does a lot of workshops to support Menla.
Okay, I don't know Menla, but
Well, it's just, Bob founded the Tibet House in New York City,
right.
and that sort of churning away, I guess, during the pandemic. And then somehow he ended up, I think, being gifted with a bunch of land up in the Catskills. He created a retreat center there called Menla.
Okay,
And
great.
that seems to be that his main focus right now is the Menla Retreat Center and keeping it functioning. It must be an expensive proposition.
Yeah, I bet.
Okay, anything else?
David, my name is Jonalyn. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I'm friends, longtime friends with Janice and Anil, who told me about your talks, and it's a process that I've been engaged in for many years. So I just wanted to say thank you, and I do plan to attend the other ones because it's very much, I have read the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I think you said that you were not going to go into the Bardo state because I'm a little confused about what you do when you see the bright lights, whether you go for them or whether you ignore them. That
question I can answer.
Oh, good.
That question I can answer. When you see the bright lights in the Bardo, your inclination is to shun them. And that's what you should not do. You should go toward them.
Oh, good.
Whatever they are. That's the only thing that I know about what you should or should not do in the Bardo.
Yeah, that part. I'm also 75, so I've been wanting to get that straight for a while. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that much I can tell you for certain.
Okay.
If the light is so bright that it bothers you, go for it.
Good. I'll keep that in mind, and I look forward to listening to the other talks. Very much appreciate tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good. All righty. Anything else?
I put the correct spelling of Horacek in the chat. It's Andrew Horacek, lucid dreaming.
Yeah, I see that, and that's helpful. Thank you very much, Connie.
Okay. All right. Well then, good night, everybody. Have a good week.